Hi, my name is Chuck Black. Welcome to this section on object-oriented programming. So you have to manage a network full of devices, and the devices are not all exactly the same. Some of them are one type of router, some of them are one type of switch. They may come from the same vendor, but even from the same vendor, there will be differences between one product family and another. There may even be differences from one version to another. So how do you deal with something like that? Well, one of the ways that you can deal with it is through object-oriented programming. So if we consider a network, if you think of the general idea of what you have in your network, you have basically a bunch of things that we might call objects. These are items such as routers and switches, links, interfaces, ports, etc. But what's true about all of these different objects or devices is that they have data associated with them. Think of a router and the data associated with it, and operations or functions or methods or procedures associated with them. Think of a device and something that you may cause to happen on that particular device. And this is a straight analogy between the devices in your network and the way that object-oriented programming works. You may have heard the term model-driven. Some different SDN controllers and other types of management systems say that they are model-driven. What they're talking about is the fact that they are using models of the network in order to manage the network. And that's what we talk about when we talk about object-oriented programming for the purposes of network programmability. So what are we talking about specifically? Well, if you look at this picture, you can see the way that traditional programming works. You have, in general, some amount of global variables. So there's some data that you're storing that is accessible by all parts of your code. And then if you've done a good job of listening to our advice and putting your common code into functions, then you'll have a number of functions that are performing various tasks. And you'll have your main application, which will be invoking those functions in order to accomplish stuff. This is how a traditional program worked. We used to call this structured programming, and it's the way that programming was written quite a while ago. But lately, we've been using the idea of object-oriented design and object-oriented programming, or OOP. So what is that all about? Well, the general idea is that, yes, you may have some utility functions that you will continue to use and to call from your main application. But what we're going to do is we're going to store a bunch of the intelligence and the data in what we call objects. And the general idea of an object is that you will define a class. And this class will define both the data associated with a particular object type and the methods, which are really functions that are used to invoke operations on that data. And what we will then do is we will use these different objects that get created based on the classes in order to perform certain functions. How does this relate to what we've talked about before with respect to the different device types that are in the network? Well, in general, we can define different classes for all of the different device types, and we can define methods that are common across all of the different device types that we're using that we can then invoke in a common manner, and they will go down and do their device-specific operations, whether that's getting interface data or getting route data or version or whatever it might be. So when we begin to put our intelligence of our application into these objects, our code becomes much more portable, much more usable, and of much more value to us as a network programmability person. So let's take a look via this demo at a little dipping our toe into the pool of network programmability using object-oriented programming. Okay, so here we are in a very, very simple demonstration of how object-oriented programming works in its simplest form, and the example that we're going to use is going to just create a couple of objects that are representing networking devices. So here's the code that we have created in order to do this. Remember, the way that you specify a class definition is you use the keyword called class, and the name that we're giving this type of class object that we're creating, it's network device. So you're going to be doing this to represent the devices in the network that you are managing. Now, one of the things that you can do inside your class, remember there are attributes or variables within the class, and then there will also be methods or functions. And so here we're defining a method or function called setInfo, and we're passing in the name, the operating system, the IP address, the username, as well as the password. And if you look at this, then you're familiar with functions. You know that these are the default values for username and password. This would make it so that anybody using my code that creates a network device object will be able to omit the username and password when they call setInfo, and we will set it automatically. And here what we're doing, we're using this self variable, which is important in classes, and you'll learn about this in the example. But we are going to set our own data, self.name, self.IP address, self.OS type, etc., to the values that have been passed in. So this is all we're doing at this initial point in time in terms of creating classes. Now, in addition to that class, you can see we've defined a print function, which is basically the print function that we had before. So we have a print function that we're going to call. So here we have object-oriented programming that is using both functions as well as class definitions. So here's our main code. There's really not too much to it, and we've hard-coded things because this is just a simple example. What we're going to do first is we're going to create an object. This is going to be a class object called network device. And remember, network device was the name of the class. And we've told Python that we're going to create an object of that class type, and we're going to call it dev1. And now remember, the name of our function or method was called setInfo. So we're going to call setInfo, and we're going to pass in actually three different parameters. One is the name of the device, one is the OS type, and one is the IP address. And remember, we left off the username and the password. And if I scroll back up, you'll recall that we've defined default username and password so that I don't have to specify them in my actual code. And that's what I did here. So now I've created one device called device1. Now I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to create another device. And this one I'm calling dev2. So here I've created another instance of this object. So now I have two networking devices. And for this one, I'm setting the information for dev2. This is the name, this is the OS type, this is the IP address, and now I'm passing in a username, which is the name and the secret password. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to print out this information. So I'm going to call print device, and I'm passing in a list of devices, and the devices are actually class objects. And if I go up here in my print device, devices list is actually receiving, instead of getting a list of lists as it has done in previous sections, what I'm passing it is a list of device objects. And so what's going to happen when it goes through this list, it's just a Python list, but each item is a device object. So for every device, I'm going to reference the various variable or attribute names for these device objects. The first one is called name, the second one is called OS type, the third one is IP address, username, and password. And if everything works well, I will print this out in some nice format, and this is my first time of using classes and objects in Python in order to accomplish this. So let's exit here, and let's see if we can actually run this program and see if it works. Okay, remember we created two devices. One was called dev1 and one was called dev2. Here is the OS type for that object. Here's the IP address that I passed in. Remember, I didn't specify the username and password, but I had default values that would be used in that method, and so we used the default values of Cisco and Cisco. For the second object I created, I have the OS type to this different value. I have a different IP address, and the username, you remember I passed in the username and the password. So this is a first look at using objects. As we go through object-oriented programming, you'll learn more about inheritance and the methods that you call, etc. But this is hopefully a good example to give you a general idea of how you can use classes and object-oriented programming in Python, and specifically in a networking environment, how you can use and create network objects to make your code that much better and that much simpler and that much more complete. Thanks for listening to this session on object-oriented programming and becoming familiar a little bit with the idea of classes and objects and methods and data and all the things associated with object-oriented programming and how you can use them in your network programmability application.